All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, for the purposes of this video, I am Andrew, aka Sophist Mindgasms, and I'm going to continue my book series on the famous Hegelian slash Marxist slash Lacanian philosopher Slavoj Zizek's book called Less Than Nothing, in my attempt to learn more about Hegel's aesthetics and other aspects of his philosophy. And in this one, he talks about how, according to Plato's definition of sophistry, Hegel was somewhat of a sophist, and also that from the perspective of Hegel, truth is immanent and a symbol, and also relate that to this video in which Slavoj Zizek talks about inner truth as a story and a comforting lie that we tell ourselves. So I'm going to go into this video first here and then read the paragraph and how it relates to Hegel specifically and truth. Here we go.
We hate them, where the motto of this conference was, it sounds so deep, was an enemy is someone whose story we were not ready to hear. It sounds so deep, you know, like, okay, this time, sorry, you, not you. You are already dead. Like, you know, I objectifies you, you are my enemy. But if I allow you to tell your story, I can see you are also a person with your fears, dreams. I can not any longer hate you. I think this.
That's interesting because he's obviously kind of mocking that sort of hippie mindset that I like to have sometimes, but also kind of mock, if you just hear the other side of the story, that person's story, then, their truth is just as valid as your truth, man. So he's kind of mocking that. And he kind of uses that perspective in his paragraph about Hegel on and his definition on truth also.
This is doubly false, worthless, existentially. First, to show you how false it is, do something very simple. Replace the general form with a concrete one. Would you also say Adolf Hitler was our enemy because we were not ready to hear his side of the story? And you should.
That's a great example, right? If you take it to the ultimate extreme, does it still make sense? No, not every truth is as valid if you attempt to take the perspective of Hitler and think, well, his truth was just as valid as anyone else's truth. You just don't look at it from his perspective. Maybe he was a good guy, and you just didn't understand him well enough. So that's basically an ultimate critique of relativism too, you could say, which is interesting because, like, I'm sure Jordan Peterson, for example, before he debated Slavoj Zizek, would have put the label of relativist on Slavoj Zizek, which is, of course, as a straw man, incorrectly attributed to so-called postmodernism all the time, which is actually more like post-structuralism, but neither Foucault nor Derrida labeled themselves that way anyway. But he's he kind of changes from time to time because Slavoj Zizek is such an interesting character, but he's basically, making a very harsh critique of relativism here. And he kind of has like a modernist or materialist and or rationalist perspective sometimes. He kind of just likes to be contrarian, I would say. And he's using that to criticize Hegel, even though Hegel himself, contrary to popular belief, he was an obscure continental philosopher like many others, such as Heidegger, for example. But he still was kind of a modernist or a rationalist in some sense, because to kind of oversimplify one of his main theses in Phenomenology of Spirit, his most famous book, it was kind of about how from the moment of creation or the moment or the Big Bang, or however you look at it, whether you look at it theologically or rationally and from a secular perspective, from the beginning of time, we're ultimately leading gradually towards the conclusion where we can be how God discovers himself, or the spirit discovers itself, or the universe discovers itself, which is a very fascinating and awesome idea from Hegel, if I'm getting that correct. But anyway, that's the point, is that this is a very good critique of relativism.
Truth. This is why, in spite of
That
all its
that Hitler's truth were obviously not as valid as everyone else who disagreed with him.
problematic character, and who has the time today to read 1,000 pages, is it already translated in German? I'm not sure. That novel, Les Bienveillants, The Kindly Ones, Jonathan Littell. This is why it provoked such an unease, because it tells the story from the side of a mid-level bureaucrat, Holocaust SS officer, who simply presents his case in detail and so on and so on. That's so horrible. I mean, here...
That's one of Slavoj Zizek's famous catchphrases, and so on and so on.
How I read also Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil. I mean, you know, when you have an evil person who does horrible things, it's not that if you look closely, you will discover a monster. No, you will discover somebody who likes his children. Maybe he's even ready to sacrifice himself for his friends, and so on and so on. Incidentally, if you read that book, which is totally worthless theoretically, I think, but was a bestseller, Goldhagen, Hitler's Willing Executioners. The only interesting thing I find in this book is the name of the author. This is a guy who claims that, you know, anti-Semitism is his German collective identity and so on. And this guy's name is Hagen and Gold. Hagen, you know, it's the figure in Wagner's Ring who is looking for gold. It's a wonderful joke. Okay, but what I want to say is that the only good part of that book is, I think, one of the middle chapter, documentary chapter, where he quotes all the home letters, and effectively you can see how the very people who were killing children, blah, 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 beating Jews out of the ghettos in Eastern Europe, were ready to then in a battle to sacrifice for a friend. They cared about their children. I mean, I don't think there is any truth in how you from within experience yourself. The story you are telling yourself about yourself, this is what in psychoanalysis we call fantasy as a fundamental lie.
The story we tell ourselves about ourselves is a fantasy. So what we tell ourselves about what reality is and our identity is a convenient fiction.
The fundamental lie, that's not the truth. The truth is what you try to cover with the story. The truth is,
so in that sort of narrative, like what relativists would say, has it backwards. It's not the truth is what we cover up the story with. The story, it's not that the story is the truth. It's that the truth is what we use to conceal the story. That's very interesting.
In X-Files, you know, the truth is out there. I mean, you know...
that's a stupid, like, rationalist, materialist perspective too. The truth is out there. It's kind of like a paradoxically metaphysical belief in this force of truth out there in the universe, like almost like the equivalent of a god, or the force of the universe, like gravity, like any forces of physics. It's kind of funny.
Inner self-experience is not true. And here, I think, poets were always
inner self
ready
is not true. Inner self-experience.
To provide the way you experience yourself, and in this way to be used to legitimize violence and so on and so on. So if you...
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very poignant, that our inner truths about ourselves and reality are what we use to cover up the stories of life, and what we use to justify unimaginable atrocities like the Holocaust. And it's what Hitler used to justify the Holocaust. This is my story. This is my truth. This is my truth. This is my identity. Therefore, the Holocaust is correct, and that sort of shit, right? So it's very interesting. So I'm going to read this paragraph from Less Than Nothing here, and explain how it relates to that in terms of truth, because he's talking about Hegel and his perspective on truth. Okay, so The sophists broke down the mythic unity of words and things, playfully insisting on the gap that separates words from things. And philosophy proper can only be understood as a reaction to this, as an attempt to close the gap the sophists opened up, to provide a foundation of truth for words, to return to mythos, but under the new conditions of rationality. So a new uh, rationalist mythology in order to figure out what truth. The goal of philosophers is to form a new rationalist mythology in order to figure out what the truth is what he's saying there. This is where one should locate Plato. He first tried to provide this foundation against the sophists, like how we find out what's true. Provide this foundation with his teaching on ideas, capital I ideas, like his realm of ideas, or also known as the realm of forms, which is this sort of transcendental, not transcendental, that would be more like of a Kantian thing, but this sort of transcendent place or, state of being in which there are perfect forms or perfect versions of things. Like there's a perfect version of a chair, there's an ideal version of a chair, there's an ideal version of a lighter, of a flag, of a mic, that sort of thing. And they're all, you can evaluate all of these on a spectrum in terms of what is more perfect and less perfect. That's basically kind of his realm of Plato's realm of ideas, or realm of forms in a nutshell. Okay, so Plato first tried to provide this foundation with his teaching on ideas, and when in Parmenides, he was forced to admit the fragility of that foundation, of the foundation for truth, because foundationalist philosophies rest on a priori claims as the foundation for what they use to figure out their epistemology and ontology in terms of how we can know things and what reality is. That's what foundationalists use. They use a priori claims as the foundation for how they figure out these philosophical answers to these philosophical questions. And in Parmenides, Plato was forced to admit the fragility of that foundation. Yeah, because a priori, every foundationalist philosophy rests on a priori faith claims. So you can say, like Descartes' example, for example, I think, therefore I am. He is starting that with the a priori faith claim that he thinks. He doesn't actually know that he can think. So he's assuming that he can think, and then therefore, because he thinks, he knows that he exists. But he's starting off from an a priori claim. So anyway, the fragility of Plato's foundation. He engaged in a long struggle to reestablish a clear line of separation between sophists and truth. The irony of the history of philosophy is that the line of philosophers who struggle against the sophistic temptation ends with Hegel, the quote-unquote last philosopher, who in a way is also the ultimate sophist, embracing the self-referential play of the symbolic with no external support of its truth. Yeah, so he's kind of talking about truth as a symbol, but there's no external proof of why these symbols represent truth, and they're more true than the sort of rationalist, a priori foundationalist way of figuring out rational truth from a more scientific perspective, perhaps. For Hegel, there is truth, but it is immanent to the symbolic process. So I think he means immanent in terms of what Alfred North Whitehead described as an immanent God, meaning that it's not omniscient or omnipresent or all of those words. God is kind of human in a way, and you can change God in the same way that God changes us, and it's sort of a reciprocal relationship in that way. So if you look at truth in that way, then truth is immanent in the symbolic process would mean that truth truth changes us as much as we change truth. So we can change what is true as much as what is true changes us. And in terms of the symbolic process, what is symbolic changes as much as what is symbolic changes what is true as much as what is true changes what is symbolic. So their truth is kind of intertangled with symbols. But as he says, the problem, as Slavoj Zizek says, the problem with that is that it's self-referential in a way. Truth is symbolic, but you're starting that off with an a priori faith claim definition too. So it's almost impossible to avoid these sorts of a priori claims, which is why you can just admit that that's a thing and be a foundationalist. But I prefer to just be a profound skeptic and assume that I don't know whether anyone can know what is true, rather than that no one can know what is true, because that's just as dogmatic as dogmatism to say that no one knows what is true, which is why I'm a Pyrrhonian skeptic specifically, which is an ancient Greek type of skepticism, which is more centered around uncertainty rather than basically faith claims that no one can know what is true. But anyway, for Hegel, there's truth, but it is immanent to the symbolic process, as I said. The truth is measured not by an external standard, but by the quote-unquote pragmatic contradiction, the inner inconsistency of the discursive process, the gap between the enunciated content and its position of enunciation. So this is what Hegel calls the pragmatic contradiction. So since there's a gap between the discursive process, or no, the enunciated content and its position of enunciation. So there's a gap, there's an unavoidable gap between what we see and what we define as reality, and the fact that we have a position and vantage point through which we are analyzing reality and deciding what is real. So this leads to the pragmatic contradiction in terms of truth being symbolic, because if you go with the pragmatic or the philosophically pragmatist definition of truth, I'm probably going to mangle it here, but it's roughly basically what is true is what works for now, that helps us to live more effective lives. What is true is what is most pragmatic. It doesn't mean like it's true that you have to have sex with me, therefore you hot chick should have sex with me. It just means that, truth is temporary and can change, but we should still believe that something is truth, which I'm a little hesitant to believe, but I appreciate that definition of truth from the pragmatists. But Hegel, or not Hegel, Slavoj Zizek is pointing out that this is the pragmatic contradiction, because we go with what is pragmatically true, based on empiricism. Like William James, for example, one of the most famous pragmatists, justifies his pragmatist conception of truth based on empiricism. What we see and what we observe defines what is true, basically, and this leads us to a temporary version of what is truth. But this is a pragmatic contradiction because it's an empiricist observation. We use our senses in how we observe the world to determine what is true, even for now. So even these temporary pragmatic truths are contradictory. So basically, it seems like the point of this paragraph is that Hegel, or Slavoj Zizek, is both criticizing Hegel and people who would disagree with Hegel, that Hegel's kind of definition of truth is self-referential, and the pragmatist definition of truth is contradictory. And you could say that truth is a story, and that it's paradoxically a lie from that perspective, but these ways of defining truth are unavoidably contradictory or self-referential in a way. So yeah, that was some really interesting, detailed philosophy there. Hope you liked that explanation of some of Slavoj Zizek's theory on Hegel's definition of truth in relation to the pragmatist definition of truth, and symbolism and how it can be immanent, and relativism in relation to foundationalism and Plato's form. So yeah, that was a fun little philosophy deep dive there. So check out the other videos in this series on Slavoj Zizek's book called Less Than Nothing. Check out my last video, which was a short of basically just explaining that my favorite mangler of professional philosopher, until very recently professional tweeter and former mathematician, James Lindsay, basically his paranoid conspiracy theory about trans people is that a giant evil cabal of trans activist groomers are converting children to be gay. So check that out. Along with the last one I did about Sam Harris literally saying that conspiracies to prevent Trump from getting democratically elected are okay because Trump is the equivalent of an asteroid headed to destroy Earth. So check out that exciting stuff. And check out Ideally Tomorrow. I'm finally going to do my movie chat on the documentary called Reversing Roe with Dusty and Chris, who I always do movie chats with, which is about the decades-long process through groups like the so-called moral majority pressuring Republicans that led to a long history of legislation that ended up in Roe versus Wade being returned recently in the U.S., overturned rather, in the U.S. And yeah, so like this video, share it everywhere, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description of the video as always. And if you give me $10 a month, you can vote on future topics, books, and movies that I will discuss both by myself and with others. And like I always say, always remember this. The funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And I love you all, and keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, read Slavoj Zizek and read Hegel. Hegel's very hard to understand, but Slavoj Zizek is a little easier and more entertaining. And just watch the tons of longer videos and shorter clips of him talking about controversial subjects, and that's a good way to learn about his philosophy, even if you don't end up doing the reading, which I also highly recommend. All right, so I've talked long enough now, and adios until next time, everyone.